All right. Why good news makes good sense. This is a good news presentation. We're about to meet Sue Papadoulis, who is the founder and journalist of the Good News movement and Profile Media. She was born in Perth. She still lives in Perth. Sue is a former journo who always had an interest in the good news stories and the power of positivity. About 10 years ago, as a news journalist in Australia and London, she became the youngest radio news director in the country. But with success came disillusionment and an early midlife crisis and the realisation of the negative impact that she was having in telling the news, which is largely bad news, from around the world. She did a stint, as she says, quote, on the dark side in the world of PR, and that was sufficient for her to realise that she didn't belong in that world either, and so she established her own firm called Profile Media, where she employs former results-driven journalists. Her clients are carefully selected for their shared values and a mission to change the world for the better. Her desire is to make a positive difference, and this led to the creation of the Good News movement, which is a platform to share good stories, positive content, and to demonstrate to the media that there is an audience out there who are genuinely interested in hearing the good news stories. When she is not spreading the good news, she loves hiking in nature. Next weekend, she'll be setting out on a hike, hiking 80 kilometres in WA, doing the Bibbulmun Track for 3 days with 3 of her girlfriends from high school. Her plan is to one day do the Camino walk in Spain. Her guilty pleasure, this is not fake news, this is real news, and I just want to say that so that people realise that I'm not making this up. Her guilty pleasure is watching The Bold and the Beautiful each week together with her husband and together with her children. The family sit around and they watch the good news stories on Bold and the Beautiful. She joins us to give us the good news and hopefully a little bit of an update on what happened when Hope surprised Liam with a memento from his past and how Brooke and Ridge's illegitimate daughter is coming along. Hopefully we're going to find out all of those news stories. Ladies and gentlemen, she is the Sandra Sully of Social Good. Please welcome Sue Papadoulis.
Is Sue, and I'm a recovering journalist. I'm going to ask you to participate now. I'm going to ask you in a moment for a round of applause when I ask you a question. So if you agree with this question, I want you to applaud really loudly. Who feels that the news is too negative and depressing? Yeah, and that doesn't surprise me because it's actually what the media sets out to do. Just a quick look at headlines in recent times. The massacre in Margaret River, a near miss for Qantas on the runway in Perth didn't actually happen, but it still made front page news. New claims against Craig McLachlan, a killer grandfather, a dreadful story about a footballer and a schoolgirl and a missing wife, a husband murders his wife, or as we say in the media, if it bleeds, it leads. And that's the unfortunate truth of being in the media. When I started out as a journalist many years ago, I was bright-eyed and I was enthusiastic and I wanted to change the world. I actually thought I could right social injustices, I could keep politicians to account, I could do some good in the world, and I thought journalism was actually the vehicle for me to do that. Somewhere along that journey, unfortunately, my ambition to change the world actually became a selfish ambition to foster my own career. So the stories became no longer about the people and the events in them and more about my career. I worked in Australia and went over to London for a few years and worked over there. And when I was in London, I was there actually when Princess Diana died. That's how long ago that was. And I remember feeling saddened by that tragedy, but actually quite excited that I was going to get to cover this major story. And I'm embarrassed to say that, but that's really what my view was. I was actually quite thrilled that I had this opportunity to cover this story. So, and I was excited to put it on my CV and come back to Australia. So it worked. I came back to Australia and I got the best job you can get in the media, which is news editor. So I became news editor of 2 radio stations, Talkback Station and an FM station, owned by the same company. And when I got to that point, I actually started to think more carefully about what I was doing because I had a lot of responsibility for the news, and if there was a problem, it came back to me, and I heard about it. So I started to think more carefully about what I was doing. And one of the things I decided to do actually at that point was to try and change it from the inside and launch a good news segment. So I had a good news segment going in my news bulletins for about 2 days until management heard it and then came and told me that no one liked good news and to take it off the air. So that was the end of that. I kept going, and I did a story actually that changed the whole course of my career. And that was a story about a traffic accident that happened one particular morning. So I would get into work early, 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. And the first thing we did as journalists was to ring the emergency services. So we would ring the police and the fire brigade and the ambulance to find out what tragic things had happened overnight. And that's how we populated our first few bulletins of the day. And that's actually what sets the tone for the rest of the day. And that still happens today. So that's why you see those stories about, you know, murders, robberies, car accidents, and the odd bag snatch that police will tell journalists about at that time of the day, and then that becomes a story. So on this particular day, it was a traffic accident. So I heard this, news that there'd been this accident, and, my first reaction, shamefully, was, oh good, I've got a good story for the rest of the morning. I didn't even think about the people involved in that accident. So the first story I did was the fact that there'd been an accident. The next story I did was the fact that there had been a fatal accident, so someone had been killed. So every half an hour I'm updating the news. The next story I did, we found out it had been a child who'd been killed. The last story I did was police released the name of the child who'd been killed in that accident. So I did that story just like any other story, didn't really think too much about it. And when I came out of the studio, having read the story, one of my journalists who I'd employed said to me, "There's some bitch woman on the phone." And when she said that, I had that moment of, oh my gosh, who are you? And I'm not like you, even though I'd employed you. And then she said something else that floored me. She said, "I think it's the mother of the kid who was killed in the accident." And I took a deep breath and went into my office and took that phone call. And I always get emotional when I tell this story, because you can imagine how devastated she was, and I had just made her grief worse, much, much worse, by naming her deceased child in the context of that story. And I found myself with nothing to say to her that could actually legitimise why I'd done that. There was nothing I could say that would make it okay, apart from, "I'm sorry." So I apologised, and I got off the phone, and I made a decision in that moment. 2 decisions, actually. The first was I changed the news policy, so we no longer release the name of people who'd been killed, because I realised in that moment it served no purpose than to hurt the people who were affected by that story. And the other thing I did was basically decide that was it. I wanted to leave the profession because I couldn't imagine doing this for the rest of my life. And as Andrew said, I went off into the dark side of PR, and that's a whole other story which I won't bore you with. But along the way, I guess I've always held on to that feeling of why I started journalism in the first place, which was to do some kind of social good, some kind of righting of wrongs and keeping the world to account. And I'm just very excited now that I feel like I'm on the right path to actually achieving that. I want to ask you another question. And by show of round of applause, I want to know the answer to this. Who no longer reads, watches, or listens to the news? Yeah, a good portion of you. And that doesn't surprise me, because every day we run seminars and I do a fair amount of speaking. And the overwhelming response I get from people is, you know what? And they're almost ashamed to say it. I don't actually read the news. I don't actually watch the TV news at night because it's too negative. And I actually think we're at a stage now of peak negativity, where our collective consciousness has never been so focused on the negative. And where does that collective consciousness come from? It comes from what we are exposed to on a daily basis. And it's actually very hard to get away from the news. Even though a good portion of you said you don't read, watch, or listen to it, you still will know what's going on in the world. I'm quite sure most of you know that there was a royal wedding a couple of weeks ago. I'm quite sure most of you might have heard that there was a schoolyard shooting in the US the same week. And I'm sure quite a number of you are aware of Australia's dreadful behaviour on the cricket field in South Africa earlier this year. And the reason it's hard to get away from is it's insidious. It pops up on social media. We might be in the doctor's waiting room and suddenly the news headlines pop up. Or we might be watching a different TV show and suddenly the news comes in and interrupts that program. Or it might even be an ad talking about what's coming up in the news. I'm really ultra aware of it, I think, because I have young kids. And I'm always saying, close your ears, block your eye, don't look at it while we're watching TV. The thing is, news is about what is, not what isn't. So no journalist is going to run a story about a bushfire that never happened, or a crime that wasn't committed, or in fact a bag that wasn't snatched from the arms of an old lady on the street somewhere. It's interesting that research shows that our view of the world is actually quite out of touch with reality. So while we think that the world's a really bad place because of what we see in the media, it's actually not as bad as what it seems, because the media do these stories on what has happened, not what hasn't happened. It's interesting, there's been some research done by Harvard University professor Steven Pinker, and he says the world is more peaceful now than ever before. So the number of violent crimes from war has plummeted throughout recent times. In fact, the homicide rate in Sydney is at 1 in 100,000, which is at its lowest level since 1989. And you'd never know that by reading or watching or listening to the news. So what is good news? What does it look like? It's not the grumpy cat. We see lots of those funny things shared on social media, skateboarding squirrels and grumpy cats and dancing pigs and God knows what else. That's actually not what I'm talking about. It's actually real stories. For example, the fact that Iraq held its 5th general election a couple of weeks ago in a new era of democracy for that country. The fact that world hunger is at its lowest level in 25 years. The fact the giant panda is no longer on the endangered species list. And other things like 86% of power generation out of Europe now comes from renewable sources, and wind has overtaken coal as the biggest power capacity out of Europe. India has banned disposable plastics in Delhi, and childhood cancer rates in Australia are at their lowest level in 40 years. Dropped by 40%. No, that was my wrong stat. Dropped by 40% in the last 15 years. So there's lots of good things happening. We just don't necessarily hear about them. It's a shame that the media does have this complete focus on negative stories. And I think it's really a byproduct of just the way the news has always been done. You're trained in a certain way when you start out as a journalist, and that's just something that keeps on flowing. I know that the media bemoan social media and feel like they've taken their audience and they've spoilt the party for them, but I actually think it's less about the distribution channel and more about the content that they're sharing. It's actually more about the content. People don't want to be inundated and flooded with that bad news stuff. There's an economic case for good news. There's been some research shown that advertisers, companies that advertise during the news, if their ad is shown after a piece of positive news, people are more likely to buy their products. Companies that advertise in the news after a negative story, people are less likely to buy their products. And I really wish the newsmakers would wake up to this fact that they're shooting themselves in the foot by not having more positive stories. The Huffington Post reports that positive content is shared 3 times more than other forms of content. So in this era of digital disruption, I really feel like the media needs to find a way to hang on to its audience and grow it, and realise that people have shifted their perception of news, and it's time that they also shifted their perception of what people actually want to know about. I actually think it's a bit of a generational thing. So perhaps the older generation, people from the post-war, post-depression era, I know my parents fit into this category, stuck to the news like glue. They know everything that's going on. And I really don't think that for younger people, it's that much of a big deal. In fact, I've seen stats where 18 to 24-year-olds watch something like 25 hours of news per year. So that's an amazing stat. So that story of doom and gloom is actually not serving us any longer. We are actually wising up to the fact that there are other things that are going on in the world that aren't negative. And we feel that authenticity gap between what's actually happening and what's actually reported on. We're getting much better at spotting the fake news, and the whole movement around fake news has become really big in the last probably year or two. And we feel that disconnect between, and less trusting of the media in general. So how does the media actually respond? There is hope, I'm here to tell you. There is hope that it's not all doom and gloom, and there is a way that we can help fix this. There's been studies showing that stories in the media that actually talk about a problem but provide some kind of solution are much more engaging to an audience and much more likely to get people to feel uplifted and therefore read to the end. So we don't just feel bad and weighed down by the negativity, we actually feel that there's something that we could possibly do about it. There is tragedy and there are bad things that happen, no doubt, but we're in an era of disruption. We're in an opportunity where there's creativity, there's innovation, there's opportunity, there's potential, and that needs to be reflected in the news. Our true nature as human beings is one of connection and collaboration and compassion. And that's actually what we relate to and what we respond to most when we see a story that has some kind of positive aspect to it. We actually get quite involved in that story, and no longer do we feel weighed down and depressed by the story. We start to feel empowered, and we start to feel that we could actually do something to change the world. And that's what we're talking about. And I guess that's why we're here today. We're all looking for a way to change the world. And if we could have a media that reflects that and offers some kind of hope, then we're much more likely to take action. I'm really excited to know about a movement that's coming out of Europe, led by a Dutch journalist, a lady by the name of Catherine Guildenstern, called constructive journalism. And what they're actually doing now is training journalists on how to write in a different way. So there is a positive slant in the story and there is some kind of solution at the end. And so if they can change the structure of the way a story is always being written, then that really does give me hope for the future of journalism. I think the media does need to survive because we do need to be informed and the world does need to be kept accountable. But to survive, it does really need to change its focus and respect what's happening with its audience. That old negative emotion that comes out of watching the news helped us during that era of fight and flight, which was that post-war era. But as I said, we're in a different era now, and it's those seeds of creativity, the positive emotions that can drive a society forward. And that really is the era that we're stepping into now. The media has the power and the potential to send a ripple through the world, and a positive ripple at that. So I am a recovering journalist who's very proud to say that now I'm a constructive journalist, and my vehicles to change the world have changed. The first is Profile Media, which is our PR firm, and we are all former journalists, and most of my team are here today. And we've been doing some stories for the Social Good Summit, actually. So we've had one of the speakers this afternoon, Gary, was on Channel 9's Today show this morning and on ABC. TV and radio, so we've been doing some good work for the Social Good Summit. And we want to work with companies that have a good message because we're really good at getting publicity because we're all ex-journos and we understand how it works. So we want to work with companies that have some kind of positive message to share. And perhaps most importantly is our content channel, which is called the Good News Movement. So it's come full circle for me. From when I started as a journalist wanting to have good news, I've now got my own channel called the Good News Movement where we share positive content. And it's really designed to demonstrate to the media that there is an audience for good news. So we would love you to join that. And this is our catch cry. If you could join a movement that inspired a change in the way the news is reported so there's more positivity, would you join it? We would love you to join us. We would love you to register at our brand new website, just gone live today. Yes, yay. We would love you to like our Facebook page. We would love you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're also on Instagram and Twitter. Interestingly, we had Instagram going without even posting for a couple of months, and we had 400 followers. Just because of the name, which shows you what kind of audience there is for good news. So I think, my mission is more good news, and I really believe it's the way of the future. Thank you.